Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of WarFronts. Apologies for location today. I am on holiday and I'm recording this video because the world doesn't sit still. You're very welcome. Why not give me a like? Why not subscribe? Look at this dedication. Also, Evan who wrote this was up all night. I wasn't, I was asleep. Poor Evan. Let's get into it. The Israel-Iran war is reaching a fever pitch. From Tehran to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Tehran, volley after volley of ballistic missile, kamikaze drone, and manned airstrikes have brought destruction to the two bitterest rivals of the Middle East. Decades of preparation on both sides have led to this moment, and now that the war is actually underway, the results have been, well, entirely predictable. Hundreds, if not thousands of dead civilians live in terror of death from above, and there is no sign of an imminent resolution. But as ruinous as the last several days have been, this Middle Eastern crisis still has the potential to grow exponentially worse. And look, we'll admit that it is rather strange when discussing an undeclared war of this magnitude to say that things aren't nearly as bad as they could be. But global experts agree that both Israel and Iran are holding short of some critical red lines that could take this crisis to the next level. As here at WarFronts, we aren't saying that to be optimistic. We're saying it because there are growing signs that this war is bound to ramp up to the next level, and if that happens, well, the destruction that we've seen so far will be remembered as little more than a warm-up. Now, before we begin, my usual caveat, everything that we've discussed in this episode is up to date to the best of our ability through the morning of Tuesday, June the 17th, local time in Jerusalem and Tehran. As we imagine you already know, the situation is evolving so very quickly, and there are no guarantees that the situation at the time of writing will be stable at the time of publication. Specifically, we're watching indicators that the United States is moving major assets to the region, including dozens there-to-air refueling tankers and a second carrier strike group indicating potential participation in an upcoming strike. Now, that news comes at a moment when Russia, China, South Korea, and other nations have suddenly started urging their citizens to evacuate the region immediately, and when US President Donald Trump has urged Iranians to evacuate Tehran, which is something that the people of Tehran appear to now be trying to do. If the US does choose to take part in a military strike, or has already done so by the time you see this episode, then rest assured that we will be back to talk about it, largely because if the US does do that, then Iran's entire nuclear program may be destroyed. Alright, with that out of the way, here's where things stand at the time of writing. Since the start of Israel's air campaign against Iran, codenamed Operation Rising Lion, Israel has rained down massive amounts of munitions on its historical rival. Starting on June 13th, Israel timed airstrikes to coincide with a surprise ongoing guerrilla campaign on the ground as intelligence operatives carry out acts of sabotage and targeted assassination. When it comes to personnel, Iran's losses thus far have been historic. The leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the chief of staff and leader of the armed forces, well over a dozen prominent nuclear scientists, the chief of the Iranian intelligence service, and the man who was charged with leading nuclear negotiations with the United States. Critical Iranian military and industrial infrastructure has been wiped out, including the above-ground facilities at the Natanz nuclear enrichment site, several other locations related to Iran's nuclear program, the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, numerous military bases and missile facilities, air defenses, ministries of defense and foreign affairs, oil refineries, and even a residence of the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Most recently, at the time of writing, Israel claims that it established total air supremacy over Iran, and while Iran currently recognizes about 220 people killed and 1,300 injured, independent monitoring groups suggest that over 1,000 could have been killed already. But the death and destruction in the Middle East isn't constrained to just Israel. Iran has launched retaliatory strikes of its own, using well over 100 ballistic missiles and logging numerous successful hits against Israeli territory. Those missiles have managed to break through Israel's complex interlocking air defenses in major cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Beersheba. Strikes have hit or narrowly missed everything from the IDF's headquarters to a major oil refinery to several strikes that have killed numerous Israeli civilians. While the damage cannot be compared to the devastation of the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, this is the most impactful series of air attacks against Israel in many years, bringing the ongoing hostilities home to the Israeli people in a way that the nation's adversaries have rarely achieved. Now, there will be a time for a full accounting of Israel and Iran's military operations in the future, but for the sake of brevity in today's episode, we're gonna delay a more extensive analysis of the last several days in order to focus on the current state of affairs and the immediate future. Now, at the time of writing, reports suggest that Iran may be ready to come back to the table, with Wall Street Journal reporting that Iran is trying desperately to convey an under-the-table message to cease hostilities. Specifically, Iran seems to be leaning on other Middle Eastern nations to convince the US to push Israel towards a ceasefire. Iran's public messaging has basically been the opposite, insisting that the nation would never come to the table while Israel attacks are still ongoing. But it isn't unusual that the nation's private and public positions would be different. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected the idea of a ceasefire anytime soon, instead suggesting that hostilities could ramp up even further. Now, perhaps to underscore the degree of control that Israel now has over Iranian skies, the nation struck Iranian state media while broadcasters were live on Monday, while the most recent volleys of Iranian missiles have been mostly unable to break through Israeli air defenses. All in all, the balance of power appears to be heavily favoring Israel. But with so much momentum behind it, Israel appears unwilling to accept anything less than total victory. This is one of those conflicts where truly anything can happen. But at least at the time of writing, it seems highly unlikely that Iran, Israel, and the US are going to meet at the negotiating table anytime soon. Instead, this conflict appears as if it may drag on for several more days at a minimum, and probably weeks. But if that's the case, then it's only a matter of time before Israel and Iran begin to escalate. As we said at the outset, as bad as the conflict is right now, there's still room for it to get a hell of a lot more dire based on actions that could be taken by either side. Perhaps the most economically devastating step that Iran could take would be to blockade or otherwise take action against the Strait of Hormuz, which separates the Persian Gulf from the world's oceans. The oil-rich nations of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait are completely dependent on navigating through the Strait of Hormuz, while Saudi Arabia isn't entirely dependent but relies heavily on the strait and exports more oil through that passage than any other nation. If Iran were to blockade the strait, either by placing naval assets like ships or mines in the strait's waters, or by attacking ship traffic with missiles and drones, Iran could rapidly spike the price of oil and throw the global economy into chaos. For Iran, a blockade of the strait would be a desperate play at this stage, almost certain to draw the United States into the conflict to restore economic order, and quite possibly prompting the rest of the NATO alliance to join in. Even the states of the Persian Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, might consider taking their own direct military action against Iran, meaning that in a worst-case scenario for Iran's leaders, the decision to blockade the strait could backfire by allying not just Europe, but much of the Arab world militarily with Israel. At the same time, however, Iran will retain the ability to cause chaos in the Strait of Hormuz off of its own coast long after it loses most other offensive military capabilities. If Iran perceives that due to a lack of other options that the risk-reward trade-off is worth it, then an attack on the strait would absolutely present the world with a legitimate and global economic threat. Another red line that Iran has yet to cross is the known enrichment of uranium to weapons grade. At the time of writing, although Iran's surface-level facilities at the Natanz enrichment site are thought to be mostly or completely destroyed, the underground enrichment facility at Fordow has yet to be hit. That's a site that probably could be destroyed only by direct and highly innovative infiltration and sabotage by Israel, or by the deployment of America's massive ordnance penetrator bombs, widely regarded as the world's most dangerous bunker buster and held exclusively in America's arsenal. Now, at the time of writing, America has chosen not to engage in the air war against Iran directly, and so long as that's true, Fordow will likely remain operational, meaning that Iran retains its ability to produce weapons-grade uranium in the span of just a few days. It would take far longer for Iran to actually make a functioning nuclear missile, but even simply presenting the world with weapons-grade fissile material would be a major statement by Tehran. It would also be a hell of a gamble, possibly forcing Israel to take a pause, but possibly prompting the US to get involved directly and ensure that Iran can never build a warhead. And third, Iran could engage in a far larger air attack than any of the attacks on Israel that it's launched to this point. Iran has yet to deploy larger numbers of its more advanced missiles, instead expending mostly older kit, and critically, it has yet to engage in the sort of combined ballistic missile, cruise missile, and kamikaze drone attack that we saw from Iran last year. Iran is widely understood to have accrued enough data from its 2024 strikes, as well as its strikes thus far in the current exchange, to be able to calibrate hard-hitting strikes that use high volumes to kamikaze drones to soak up Israel's air defenses before punching through with well-timed ballistic missile hits to inflict the bulk of the damage. That would allow Iran to directly call America's bluff, giving the US plenty of time to intervene and take out a slow-moving drone swarm if it chose, but engaging militarily on unfavorable terms and probably being targeted directly by Iran after that. And if such a strike did hit Israel, then Iran could do far greater damage than it's done thus far in the conflict. For Israel, easily the most rapid act of escalation would be to target Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei, possibly along with figures like President Masoud Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and other leaders who have escaped the worst of the violence so far. Israeli leaders reportedly had an opportunity to assassinate Khamenei, but were told not to do so by America's President Trump, although it's not clear whether that version of events is an accurate retelling or part of a broader charade that the US and Israel have engaged in to manipulate Iranian perceptions of the situation. Netanyahu has explicitly refused to rule out the prospect of assassinating Khamenei in the coming days, arguing that such an act would end the conflict rather than escalating it, as the Trump team reportedly feared. Short of killing the supreme leader, Israel could more extensively target Iranian oil fields and refineries, its natural gas infrastructure, or both. Those are immensely valuable targets for Iran, but although Israel has struck some Iranian energy assets and vice versa, these strikes have remained quite obviously limited so far. Iran has partially suspended its production of oil and natural gas, anticipating potential larger attacks after Israel's first wave of hits, but whether they're producing or not, Iran's drilling and gas fields would go up in smoke if they were targeted at scale. Similarly, Israel could target the nuclear complex at Fort Al more directly. Even if Israel weren't able to completely destroy Iran's underground facilities, it could try to make the facilities difficult or impossible to access by surface-level bombardments. Or depending on how extensively Israel has pre-positioned its intelligence assets, it could find a way to sabotage the facility deep underground. That would be an immensely difficult attack to pull off, but then again, this is the same nation that planted thousands of explosive pages within the ranks of Hezbollah. And of course, Israel could find a way to get the United States involved. If Washington were brought over the threshold, it would immediately bring to bear some of the most dangerous warfighting assets on the planet. Everything from stealthy strategic bombers and the ordnance they carry to naval assets that could shatter a blockade of the Persian Gulf. It could even bring to bear one of the largest ground armies in the world in an absolute worst-case scenario. But still minor slap on the wrist for Iran to the all-out devastation of Tehran's military assets. Although American involvement would certainly bring Israel closer to its goals and would come with the de facto access to the best of America's military arsenal, it would also come with some risk for Netanyahu, as a directly involved United States could be interested in forcing changes to the ongoing air campaign and would gain new leverage for that very purpose. Again, this situation is evolving very rapidly, and there are no guarantees that any of those red lines won't already have been crossed by the time you see this episode. For now, though, all we can do is watch and wait, as a war that was decades in the making plays out before our eyes. Thank you very much for watching. I'm going to go back to my holiday. Vacation. Americans call it a vacation. I'm on vacation!